All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the climate panel. I see that our speakers are starting to join. I'm Ariana. I'm a junior analyst with NUImpact Energy and Environment Vertical, and I will be moderating. So we have with us this evening Ryan Dings, the Executive Vice President at Greentown Labs, Shalonda Baker, Professor of Law, Public Policy, and Urban Affairs at Northeastern, and co-founder of the Initiative for Energy Justice. And I believe shortly we should also have Daniel Faber joining, who is a professor of sociology at Northeastern and director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. So today we'll be discussing the misaligned incentives that encourage large corporations to make decisions that harm people and planet while benefiting their bottom line, as well as the disproportionate impact that the climate crisis has on low-income communities and other marginalized groups. So as you're likely aware, the climate crisis is here. Global average temperature has risen roughly 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, and the past 5 years have been the warmest on record. Sea level is rising at a rate of 3.3 millimeters per year, posing a threat to coastal communities, including Boston. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have roughly 10 years left to cut global emissions before we're locked in for more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and the consequences that come with that. Luckily, there are steps that we can take to meet this goal. So with this panel, we're hoping you'll leave with a better understanding of how we got to this point with the climate crisis, the risks we face as the Greater Boston community, and where we go from here. So to start off, Shalonda, Ryan, could you each please introduce yourself, your role and your place of work, and maybe talk a bit about how you wound up in your current position? Or it looks like Ryan may have dropped. So Shalonda, would you like to introduce yourself?
I think Ryan was having some technical difficulties with the audio, and I saw Danny in another virtual space out there. So hopefully the team is helping him get be able to join the panel. So first of all, I just want to thank you for organizing this. I think it's so terrific that a group of students more focused on some of the business and corporate dimensions of climate have put this together. I mean, just by way of introduction, I used to be a corporate lawyer. I worked on large energy projects. So I helped to finance massive projects, mainly in New England. I did that work a little bit in Japan. I was working in Japan during the financial crisis of 2008. And I just realized that I was, helping to sort of fix a financial system that was obviously broken. It was the hottest year on record at that time. And it didn't seem like we were doing much to change, our trajectory with respect to climate. So I took the big leap of faith, left corporate America. I actually ended up moving to Mexico, which I can talk a little bit about later, on a one-way ticket, and found myself really enmeshed in climate and energy debates. While in Mexico, I met indigenous people who were fighting against large-scale wind, and that started me on my journey to really investigate energy justice issues. So the social justice, equity dimensions of the transition away from fossil fuels. Fast forward 10 years later, I now teach at Northeastern, and I co-founded and now co-direct as well the Initiative for Energy Justice, which you mentioned in your intro. And we work on providing technical assistance and research support to frontline leaders, so folks who are on the front lines of climate change, as well as policymakers who are interested in equity-centered energy and climate policy. So there are many, many, many steps there in between, but hopefully we can get into that a little bit in the conversation. We're interested in equity
All right.
climate policy. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for speaking. Ryan, have you had any luck with your audio? All right, looks like that's still a no.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. We're all set.
All right, perfect. So I don't know if you've heard the initial question, but if you'd like to start off and just please introduce yourself, your role and your place of work, and a bit about how you wound up in your current position.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right. So we are still in backstage?
No, we're live now.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, forgive me. Sorry about that. So, well, good evening, welcome, and forgive me for figuring out my technical difficulties. It's always fun dealing with Zoom and Hopin and all these platforms. My name is Ryan Dings. I'm Executive Vice President, General Counsel at Greentown Labs. Greentown Labs is the largest clean tech incubator in North America, one of the largest communities of climate action-oriented entrepreneurs, investors, thinkers, leaders in the world. And it's located right in Somerville, Massachusetts, so not too far from the Northeastern campus. We have the great benefit of working with a lot of Northeastern students through our co-op program, not only the Greentown Labs team, but all the startup companies that work at Greentown Labs. And it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, talk with all of you about this ecosystem, about climate action, about what we can do together to move it forward. My role at Greentown Labs is both an operational one in terms of managing the Greentown Labs team that runs the incubator services and helps the startups, as well as all the fun legal work that I get to do as the company's general counsel to help Greentown Labs grow and the organization move forward. And in fact, 2021 will bring a new location for Greentown. In our first ever expansion, we are opening up an incubator in Houston, Texas, which is really exciting. And so that is something to look forward to next year. And I think a real marker for me, or really strong evidence that this clean tech ecosystem is growing dramatically. And if there is a lot of interest in Houston, Texas for an incubator like Greentown, there's a lot of interest nationally in this clean tech ecosystem, which is so deeply rooted in Boston and New England, becoming a real economic force in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Ryan. It's very exciting to hear about the new Houston location. So, Daniel, would you be able to give an introduction as well?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank Natasha and Spencer, Izzy, Mason, and you, Ariana, for all the great work you've been doing, and thank you for having me here tonight. I'm director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. I'm Daniel Faber, and I'm also a senior research fellow with the new Global Center for Climate Justice, and kind of a think tank research institute that helps provide strategic resources for the climate justice movement. And we're based here in Boston, but we have research fellows from all over the world. And we're going to be launching come, I think, around January. It's a brand new institute. And I'm on the board of Coming Clean. And Coming Clean is a collaboration of about 300 different organizations in the United States, ranging from the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, Greenpeace, NRDC, a lot of fracking groups, American Sustainable Business Council, that is trying to forge a more transformative environmental justice politics in the US, which goes to the root causes of the ecological crisis and kind of moves beyond single issue approaches or band-aid approaches to more holistic, more deeper approaches, which go to the root causes of the ecological and climate crisis. So I have always had one foot in the academy and the other foot in movement circles and getting pulled in both directions. So it's great to be here tonight. So thank you for having me.
Great to have you. So since we're all interested in it, could you each talk a little bit about, in more depth, about how your work seeks to create change? Are there specific levels and types of change that you focus on, or any goals you have specifically that align with the theme of today's breakout session?
Most of that. You're kind of coming in and out a little bit, Ariana. It's a sign of the times. Well, so Ryan and Danny, it's so great to share the stage with you both. Danny, it's great to see you again. Ryan, it's wonderful to meet you. So I think the question was, how do we work, right? Like at what levels? And so like Danny, I'm an academic. I'm a lawyer by training, and as I mentioned before, and my work has mainly focused on the social justice and equity dimensions of our transition away from fossil fuels. And my activism kind of work, my outward facing work, is through the Initiative for Energy Justice. And we work at the state level. So just a little bit of a backstory on how the initiative got started is before I joined the faculty at Northeastern, I was actually at the University of Hawaii School of Law. And so I got to Hawaii in 2014, just as that state was embarking on a very ambitious trajectory with respect to clean energy. It had adopted, the state had passed, or the legislature had passed, and the governor had signed into law the 100% renewable portfolio standard in 2014, or I'm sorry, summer 2015. And the state was reaching limits with respect to rooftop solar. It was experimenting with community energy. And I got to sort of be a kid in the candy store, really figuring out domestic energy policy while I was there. But in every conversation I had with stakeholders about community engagement, using the transition as a vehicle to create structural change and, remediate environmental injustice, people would look at me like I had 2 or 3 heads, because they typically saw the energy transition as a technical transition, one that didn't have any social dimensions. So I worked on bringing community voices into that transition through law and policy. And then when I got to Northeastern, I decided to launch an organization that would do the very same thing, but at the national level. And so we also have a team of around a dozen researchers, give or take a few here and there. Also students from around the country, but mainly New England, who are doing research to support policymakers as well as frontline leaders on energy justice, climate justice, really technical aspects of the transition, but infusing those technical aspects with equity. So that's how I work. That's sort of my theory of change around how to move the needle on equity across climate and energy.
Excellent, thank you. Equity and energy are definitely very interconnected.
I'll be glad to jump in.
Else going to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So, I think Greentown's perspective is similar in many respects in the pursuit for inclusive solutions to the challenge of climate change, but different in the fact that we are pursuing it primarily through technological advancement. So if we think of carbon neutrality as being the ultimate goal of this movement, remove all carbon from our economy, stop the emissions of greenhouse gases, slow down the warming of our planet, well, the technology we need to achieve carbon neutrality without fundamentally just abandoning our economy and all the aspects of it, that technology has not yet been created. And there's many things out there that currently exist that can help us make that push. There are many technologies that have been de-risked and now are in a phase where really there should be robust commercialization of those technologies. Solar and wind are 2 examples where, the technology's there, and it's a matter of increasing our electricity mix for more renewable resources from solar and wind, and removing coal, oil, natural gas from our electricity mix. But that only gets us so far, and there are many aspects of the economy that produce carbon and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of innovation left to take place. There's a lot of invention left to take place. Everything from industrial decarbonization to carbon capture, circularity, innovation across agriculture, food, water, all these various parts of the economy where there's still plenty of room for invention and innovation and technological advancement. And so that's where Greentown comes in. A mission-based organization that fundamentally believes in entrepreneurship as a tool to solve great social challenges, a community focused on climate action, And our goal is to get all the tools that we possibly can into the hands of the entrepreneurs. And that includes thinking about the policies that can help promote technological advancement. That includes thinking about inclusion and equity as means by which we can make this transition to a clean energy economy, an equitable one and a fair one, and frankly, make this transition work for all of us. And it includes all the financial aspects as well. So the capital that's going to be needed at all the various parts along this process, from invention, innovation to commercialization of these technologies, make sure that that capital is there to help drive this push towards carbon neutrality. And so the heart of all this is that entrepreneurship and technology advancement. And that's what Greentown is all about. And to us, none of these are siloed kind of elements or endeavors. We often talk about kind of the 4 pillars of climate action being technology, capital, policy, and justice. And I think those 4 pillars, you need every one of those working in concert in order to make to meet the challenge of climate change and make a transition to a clean energy economy that works for everyone.
Ryan. Daniel, would you like to give a little bit more of your theory of change as well?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I couldn't agree more with both Shalonda and Ryan. It's so great to be on the panel with both of you and the work that you're both. And I've worked in environmental justice circles now for some 30 years, actually longer, but I don't want to admit it. And actually did a lot of work with the EJ Fund, leadership, the EJ movement around expanding access to resources from foundations, but also working with foundations on how they can overcome the dissonance between their business side of their operations and the mission of the foundations, and how can they use their assets to do socially responsible investing and to shift assets and use their financial wealth as a tool for advancing environmental justice, including investing in the types of technological alternatives that are really needed to go to the root causes of environmental justice. And I with no doubt, we're facing a planetary crisis, and we have very little time to act. And that traditional mainstream environmental policy has proved itself inadequate to the task. And in fact, it's evoking both political reactions on the left and the right. So on the right, traditional environmental policy is often end of the pipe technology, not very effective, imposes a lot of cost on corporations, and particularly major corporate polluters have organized themselves politically to embrace neoliberal policy approaches, which attempt to roll back environmental policy, deny that the climate crisis is real. So we're witnessing one of the most profound attacks on the environmental and climate justice movements that we've ever seen. Even this past week, Trump administration replacing key scientists within the federal government with climate deniers around a new national climate assessment. So this attack continues even though the election is over, even though it may not be over in Trump's mind. So the assault is continuing. And then on the left, over the years, grassroots environmentalists and environmental justice movements developed a critique of traditional environmental policy in the sense that it often takes very single issue oriented approaches to what are complex and interrelated problems. It divorces issues of democracy and justice from environmental problem solving. And very often the types of solutions that get adopted have the unintentional impact of actually exacerbating or worsening or displacing environmental harm onto communities that lack political economic power. So while we can no longer dump toxic sewage sludge in the Atlantic Ocean, well, that's great. 1988, that law was passed. But if cities like New York load up 2,000 railroad cars each and every week and transport this toxic sewage sludge 1,500 miles across country to communities like Sierra Blanca, Texas, which is 80% Hispanic and 50% of the population lives below the poverty line, they've become the new destination, if you will, for this toxic waste. So as pollutions become commodified, it is increasingly being displaced far away from where it was originally produced onto communities that lack the political economic power to contest this. And therefore, it's no accident that we've seen a rise of the environmental justice movement with such force over the last 2 or 3 decades, because one of the hallmarks of traditional environmental policy is that in many ways it's exacerbated the extreme displacement of environmental harm onto African American communities, Latino communities, indigenous communities, Asian communities of color in general, and white working class communities as well. And I came from Kentucky and could talk a lot about what's going on in Appalachia these days. So what this really points to is the need for a more transformative environmental politics, which takes a multi-issue perspective, which can go beyond issues of distributive justice, trying to distribute the harm equitably, which is important, but really looking at ways that we can invent the new types of technologies and production processes that Ryan talks about with an eye towards justice and equity and democracy, the issues that Sholanda's talking about, to develop a more transformative environmental politics so that these harms are not produced in the first place. So it shouldn't be about not in my backyard, it should be about not in anyone's backyard. It should be about what constitutes a productive environmental justice or a transformative environmental justice. And so I'm thinking like in Europe, for example, I can talk about some different examples of what's been going on there, but there are many different new models of what constitutes a transformative environmental justice politics that I'm very excited about. Sorry for going on so long.
No, that was excellent. So since you've all touched on the topic of environmental justice and to some degree the unequal distribution of harm, and Daniel, you got into this a bit, which communities domestically and abroad face the greatest risk from climate change, and what is it that has put those communities under a greater risk? And all of you feel free to jump in, respond to each other.
Going in order. It'd be easier, Shalonda, going in order.
Yeah, this is when the virtual format is less than ideal, because I think there was so much in each of, Ryan's and Daniel's comments, Danny's comments that were relevant and so worth kind of pausing and, really digging into. And I'll pick up on a couple of those pieces in my response to this question. So, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has already said that there are certain communities that will be first and worst impacted by climate change, right? These are communities in the global south that did very little to contribute to the existing climate emergency, as well as our own communities in the global south here in the US, right? So Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that are sort of experiencing or living out, the end of decades and even, I would say, centuries of structural racism and structural inequality. And so the reason why they're first and worst impacted is because they're typically living in marginal places, right? Land that is degraded in some way, flood zones. They're not living in the best places within a region, within a city. They're often also less able to bounce back from emergencies. So if you think about, for example, the wildfires in California, where there are rolling blackouts, that has I think there's some debate about how those blackouts are rolling out, but essentially, arguably an equal impact on all Californians. However, folks who are medically vulnerable, low income, have a fixed income, are not going to be able to bounce back as quickly when a refrigerator full of food spoils or when medicine can't be replaced because they have one prescription. And if they need to replace it, if it's a refrigerated medicine, they have to pay out of pocket, right? So those are the types of things that people don't often think about when they think of climate change and how folks are bouncing back. They're like, oh, everyone lost their house. Well, the person who couldn't afford flood insurance or fire insurance lost their house and they lost wealth, right? They couldn't rebuild. So I think it's more complicated. I wanted to just pick up on the other shadow side of your question, Ariana. And the shadow side is at what cost will the US engage in its transition, right? So we're looking at New York State, for example, that has an ambitious climate change goal, to go I think 75% clean energy. I can't remember the exact year, but under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and other similarly situated states in the US that can import hydro from Canada. That has been contested a bit by communities of color in places like New York City who are saying, look, bringing in all of that hydro means that First Nations in Canada are going to be impacted, and our replacing and impacting other people of color around the world. Similarly, when we think about the technologies needed to transition to a clean energy future, we're talking about mining on the African continent, where we have kids kind of mining some of the precious metals that are needed for solar panels and batteries and other things. So we need to think about the whole picture, not only who's impacted by climate change, but who's impacted by this transition and who's going to bear the cost of the transition across the supply chain. So it's absolutely a very complicated time, and not one that you can understand by just looking at what's happening on the face of the problem.
Excellent point, and something that I think a lot of us, myself included, occasionally overlook. And so then, Ryan, just to add in an extra element that I think you touched on a bit earlier, and Shalanda, that you touched on as well, is we do have the technology to make this possible. So when we're talking about not just the groups that are going to face the most harm, how have we gotten ourselves into this position in terms of policy and economics and the financial structures that incentivize or disincentivize certain activities?
Well, I think climate change has the potential to exacerbate every single economic inequality that exists in the United States. And economic inequality is inextricably intertwined with racial inequity in the United States, because we have a multi-millennia, hundreds of years of very, consistent and intentional inequitable policy that has tried to promote these racial disparities. And you have examples of this in clean technology, where redlining, which, you can read up on this in how, redlining by federal mortgage agencies and US banks fundamentally just crushed the opportunity for African American homeownership in the 20th century. You have the same policies being applied to solar redlining, and how incentives at state and local levels, even in places that seem to have progressive virtue, the solar redlining pops up. And it baffles the mind that even in progressive states and places where you would think we would be doing everything we could to try to bring technology to communities that could just most fundamentally benefit from it, not just to improve their air, but to reduce power bills, promote clean technology, just frankly bring technology in communities, and to serve as a visual testament that they can participate in a clean energy transition too. And yet here you have solar redlining, which has truly taken place in this country, policies that have been acted on state and local levels where incentives have been construed to be more favorable in certain communities than others. That essentially is similar to housing and mortgage redlining that took place in the 20th century, and it's sadly part of our history. And so any of the work that's done around climate is not only not only should be considered fundamental to promoting economic equality, but racial equity as well, because those two are so closely connected. And the awakening in this country that, God help us, does not slow down, around racial equity, should hopefully put this front and center in legislation and policy that was passed. It should hopefully manifest itself in allocation of capital, where investors should not see risk any different based upon the communities where projects are being developed or technologies being implemented, and hopefully to the entrepreneurs themselves, that they should see opportunities in creating technology that supports all of these communities. We're here in, greater Boston, Northeastern's located in the city. I'm sitting here in my, dimly lit office in Lexington, Massachusetts. And, I can surely tell you that if you drive around some of these leafy suburbs of Boston, you find more solar panels on rooftops and Teslas and driveways than you do in certain parts of Boston. If you were driving around, Dorchester, for example. Yet, the ability to advance clean technology and put it in those communities should be, absolutely essential to kind of an equitable transition to a clean energy economy. And just, back to a point I mentioned earlier, should really serve as a testament, a visual testament, that we are darn serious about truly creating a clean energy economy that does work for absolutely everybody on this planet.
I just want to chime in a little bit there, picking up on something that Ryan said. So, I think there are two things that can happen, right? There's intentional discrimination that can happen as a result of policy, or, the structure of it is sort of inherently unfair. But even without any sort of intentional policy or policy adoption or statutory framework, the nature of our society is so vastly unequal and inequitable that if we erect an energy policy or an energy system on top of that, it's automatically going to be distributed along inequitable lines, right? So we have to actually disrupt that underlying scaffolding so that what we hang on top of that doesn't distribute things inequitably. And that's why I argue for, in my work, an explicitly anti-racist approach to energy policy, and explicitly otherwise, we're just putting good on top of bad, which will inevitably end up bad. Or we're putting, as Ryan said, bad on top of bad, which is going to be bad anyway. So I just wanted to say that we have to think about the structural issues in our society if we're going to end up, on the right side of this.
No, that's so true. You can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but do it in a very inequitable way. And I think that should just be, understood and fundamentally clear, that it's not like, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly if you look at state and local economies, somehow it's just like, it's unicorns and rainbows, where everything's okay, that's not automatically the case.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think another way to state this is that one of the most fundamental lenses by which we should understand one's vulnerability to climate change is power, political economic power. And that's like a key determinant. And there are many different structures of power that are, there's racialized power structures, systemic racism, there are class powers at work, class structures, international economic systems, and so forth. So it's really interesting how they intersect. If we take an intersectional analysis, how do these different structures of power intersect, and where is one's positionality as an individual, as a community within these intersecting power structures? So, when you ask about vulnerability, I think, well, there are many ways in which injustices become manifest. So I was looking at a lot of the injustices that exist between the global divide between the North and the South. I was doing work with the CDC on the impacts of climate change in the Pacific Islands. So if you talk about the front lines of climate change right now, literally there are islands in the Pacific that are being washed away. And so the climate crisis is really most acute in the global South. 300,000 deaths that occur each year from climate change. 90% of them are in the global south. And the British government estimates that by 2050, we're going to see about 200 million climate refugees. That's now held to be a fairly conservative estimate. Cornell study just came out recently, estimated by toward the 2070 or later, we could see as many as 1 billion people displaced by climate change. If you're looking at a 40% ecosystem collapse with a 5 degrees centigrade temperature increase, which now even Hadley and most of the major climate change centers are predicting. All the models now are running red hot. They've ramped up their projections as all the biofeedback mechanisms kick in. There's socioeconomic injustices within countries that increase vulnerability. If you don't have home insurance and you get flooded out, like the African American population in the 9th Ward, 175,000 left. Only 75,000 came back. They couldn't rebuild. They couldn't get loans. They didn't have insurance. The levees weren't adequate. They are climate refugees within the United States. So definitely systemic racism, class exploitation are really prominent in one's vulnerability to climate change within the United States as well as other nations. And then I think there's this intergenerational notion that future generations really have a lot on the line. The biggest impacts of climate change are going to be felt by future generations. And it's really clear now. For me, this is the first time in my life where I can really see and feel climate change. It's become so apparent. And we're looking at a category 5 hitting a country I worked in for years, Nicaragua, sort of as we speak, and they just had a category 4 last week. This is unprecedented. So it's very obvious that the impacts of climate change are now becoming much more widespread. They're reaching deeper and deeper into the social fabric of not only our country, whether it be hurricanes or the wildfires in California, but throughout the world. And so this is truly a planetary emergency that requires a full mobilization. But I think this is the key point, and I'd like to pick up with what Shalonda and Ryan are saying. It's very easy for us to retreat in the face of the magnitude of this crisis. And this is very hard for a lot of people to deal with emotionally and psychologically. And I think the way we combat that is by creating a positive vision of the future, how climate change can be a catalyst for creating the best society the world has ever seen, for bringing about the new technologies, for addressing these injustices, for tackling systemic racism. Because a positive vision of the future can be inspiring and bring people to want to be part of this movement. And so I think that's the challenge we face as scholars and activists, is to create this vision and show how we can use climate change as a catalyst for creating a better world.
So since you touched on that catalyst for a better society, and all of you have highlighted a lot of the things that really underlie this, what changes and adjustments do we need to make to our financial structures, our social structures, to be able to effectively combat climate change and really build that better society after this? Anyone can feel free to start off.
Well, I'll just jump in and feel free to interrupt me anytime. Well, one is if it's a truly level playing field right now in the market, then fossil fuels really can't compete in a really important way. The new studies by the IMF and World Bank, the fossil fuel industry receives nearly $1 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies each and every year. Some of those estimates are actually well above that. And in the United States, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that go to prop up the fossil fuel industry. The subsidies are massive, and particularly in comparison to what goes to renewables. So if it's truly a level playing field, and you take into account all the externalities, all the harm done by fossil fuels, renewables come out on top. And we have to make this transition to an economy based upon fuels from heaven, wind and solar, and push out the fuels from hell, when the coal, gas, and oil. And it should be happening now, but the federal government in many ways has been colonized by the polluter industrial complex, by the oil and gas industry, and they are really manipulating markets and investments in new technology and alternatives to try and preserve the power of their industry. If they burn all the $27 trillion of known fossil fuel assets, we will go 5 times beyond what the scientific community says is safe, and we're going to be in a world that's 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century. So we really have to we need this mass movement that can take on the power of the plant, the oil and gas industry, but we have to go after where they get the power. We have to go after these subsidies. We have to go after the tax breaks. We need finance reform and so forth. We need to remove their political economic power and the corrosive impact it has on our democracy. So that's just one.
I'm so surprised, Danny. I know you and I know your work, and I'm so surprised that you didn't go straight for the jugular there. The capitalist elephant in the room. I mean, I think, so Ryan kind of touched on this, and I'm going to go for the jugular. I'm just going to go. I couldn't agree with you more about subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, but I think as long as we're still relying on a fundamentally extractive economic model that requires growth, that requires, in many ways, displacement, dispossession, exploitation, we are doomed to replicate inequality in this clean energy transition, right? And I think, as Ryan said, we can absolutely get to a 100% renewable energy future. I'll tell you what it looks like in a place like Mexico. So my academic career started in Oaxaca, which is the windiest place in the world. One of the most indigenous places and poorest places in Mexico, with 14 different indigenous groups, a place called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is a narrow sort of stretch of land that separates the Pacific and Atlantic from each other. And there's a wind tunnel. So again, it's the windiest place in the world. And it has now the highest concentration of onshore wind in the world, with the largest wind projects in Latin America also there. And so what that means is that we have families pitted against each other. We have displacement. We have farmers who are now no longer able to farm. They have no economic interest in those projects because we have major corporations that are sort of relying on the same extractive model to do the cheapest thing, to not engage communities, to move full steam ahead in this transition. And yeah, it's clean, but it's also at great cost in terms of the social and environmental costs. So I think we also have to sort of question the underlying logics of capitalism and really disrupt them. And Danny, I stole your line. I mean, that's like normally what you say, but I agree, I'm aligned, but I also think we need to sort of challenge some of those underlying fundamentals. And a framework that is useful is the just transition. So it's moving away from an extractive economy to one that is regenerative. And that might sound like pie in the sky, but renewable energy actually lends itself to ownership. As Danny said, I mean, it's something that comes from heaven, right? It's something that is just a natural part of being on this earth. So in that sense, we should all have a stake in it. We should all have an ownership stake. We should all have an interest in it. And so we need new economic systems to support that equitable transition. So that's my I'm throwing it in there. I know this is a business audience, but I'm up for it. Let's talk about it.
To my conclusion, so that's all right. But seriously, I think there's like a distinction between preemptive reforms and radical or revolutionary reforms. And there are reforms that prevent or prohibit further actions. And then there are the types of reforms that we can work for that serve as building blocks for building a larger climate justice movement, for building about larger processes of social transformation. So we can promote solar in a way that where you have large solar collectors out in deserts and they're still owned by utility and they still charge consumers. Or we can have a type of solar technology that goes directly on a facility and provides energy not only to that unit, but to the neighborhood, where the owner of the house now becomes not just a consumer, but a producer, the owner of the energy. And that's a type of emancipatory solar technology where you have more different types of social ownership, where access is democratized and it's more equitable. And so I think that justice vision into promoting these more radical type reforms that can be building blocks for building a more emancipatory type of climate justice politics and promoting green chemistry and closed loop production and clean production, and building a just transition for labor so that as they get displaced in the fossil fuel industry, they get reintegrated and retrained. I think, some type of Green New Deal that does all of these things, that serves as building blocks for building these types of transformations is essential for what we need right now. But the larger vision, I think the profit imperative can be a corrosive influence on where we want to see a democratization of essential energy services and so forth. We can't leave it up to the free market. We have to have greater social control and ownership of those key sectors, which are essential to this transition. Absolutely.
I looking at the chat, and which is an interesting new feature of these panels and presentations, right? You get to see the chat going on, and Shalonda calling out the Just Transition Framework. I read that a few years ago when I was running a fund, and our fund was investing entirely in solar and storage solutions. And it was given to me by someone, and I sat down and I read it one day, and it, in 20 or so pages, fundamentally changed how I looked at renewable energy and its place in a clean energy economy. So I recommend folks read that as well. There's a lot of good topics here, and I feel like I could grab a bottle of wine and we could keep this conversation going for like the next 3 hours if my kids just did not come running into this office. A few rapid fire thoughts from me on all of this. If you want a technology that's going to change how we think about things, it's long duration storage, because then that pushes an electrification movement, which I can think can be more democratizing than a lot of clean energy or clean technology to date. If you want a kind of technological notion on trying to address some of these underlying problems, then it's circularity, creating a circular economy. What are the technological innovations that we can advance where we keep all that we have produced in the value stream or the kind of supply chain of this economy? If you want a book, and I certainly buy Shalonda's forthcoming book, of course, but if you want a book that is really interesting, and I love my colleagues at Greentown Labs, they're wonderful people, and we have this book club that we've been doing this year, and the book we're reading right now, it's Let My People Go Surfing, and it's all about Patagonia's struggle, right? Great company, probably a lot of folks on this listening in, watching, own Patagonia products. It's their intense struggle with this notion that to survive, they needed to grow and profit, which fundamentally undercut everything that these people believed for. And if you want a life's work, for those folks who are listening who are students and who are thinking about this maybe from a career perspective, then I can tell you that, climate as your life's work, thinking about what your career will be for the next 30 or 40 years, couldn't be, I think, a more useful kind of pursuit, because you can approach it from any angle you want. You can be a climate-focused finance professional. You can be a climate-focused lawyer. You can be a technologist, a policymaker, an advocate. You can work for the biggest company or the smallest company. They all have balance sheets that need to be fundamentally repurposed to address climate risk. And they all have income statements that need to be fundamentally rethought to address what they're producing and selling in this time of great climate change. And so I think about my kids who have not come running in yet, and I thank God. But I think about my two girls, and I think about the world they're going to be living in 2050. And not to freak anybody out, but I wonder some days, are they going to have kids? Like, and
20, Brian, what world are they living in 20?
Yeah, and so I just think like, and it has been, I started my career as a commercial real estate attorney, and I fell in love with the built environment. I love buildings. I love the art of it. I love the form and the function of it. I love it. And I was like a moth to a flame with clean technology and environmental movement, just because like we have this beautiful thing, this beautiful planet, and we're just messing it up. I was going to go with the F word, but I held myself back. But it's like we're messing it up. And I look at those girls and I look in their eyes and I think, yeah, you're right, Shalonda. 2020. I mean, what is 2050 going to be like? So there is an absolute opportunity. You can make a living and you can do some darn good by climate being your mission. And there are so many angles which you can approach it from. That I think there's no shortage of matching kind of your vocation or your skill or what you're really good at with this mission of trying to save the planet and make the world a more sustainable place.
I mean, actually, I don't know how much more time we have, Ariana. How are we looking?
Yeah, so we're going to switch over to doing audience questions, probably within the next couple of minutes.
Okay.
But if all of you have maybe
I want to take some things too there. Okay, let's try. Questions
maybe
are
a quick thought to sum up your position and maybe any kind of changes you'd like to see.
Sure. I mean, I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience. I just want to kind of, again, throw out a provocative notion, which is actually connected to Ryan's comment about 2050. I mean, I would argue that 2020 is very much a preview of our climate future, not only in terms of the record-breaking hurricane season that we have, the record-breaking fire season in California, floods of obviously are still, coming, and all of the many things. But it's a preview of the ways in which disaster exacerbates our underlying structural inequalities, right? Where we have folks who are classified as frontline workers who live in frontline environmental justice communities, who are disproportionately impacted by COVID in terms of illness, but it's a result of their prior status living in these environmental justice communities. So this flaying open that has happened as a result of COVID is a preview of the climate future and the climate emergency that we face. And let's look at what happened this year, right? We have wealthy folks whose kids are in school because they're either in private school or they've hired tutors. We have, the ways in which people have been able to sort of fill their own gaps because of the way our economic system is organized. So we're in a real danger here as we move into the climate future in creating a system that is even more unequal than the one we already have. And so that's like the warning, the preview that we're seeing with 2020, the year that many of us would like to be over. But it's just a snapshot into the future.
All right. So I'm going. Yes, they've just opened it up for questions. So I'll keep an eye to see what comes in, and then I'll pose anything we get to you. If Ryan or Daniel, you have a brief kind of sum up comment you would like to make, also please feel free to still make that.
Well, I think one of our challenges is to start creating a vision of what would constitute a more transformative climate justice politics. How can we start building this movement? How can we start building in the solutions and have at the same time this longer term vision of broader social transformation? And this isn't easy, this is hard, but there are some great examples and experiments all over the country. I mean, just here in Massachusetts, we were successful in creating a few years ago, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. And so the Toxic Use Reduction Institute undertakes research on behalf of industries throughout the state to develop alternatives to toxic chemicals, to develop new production techniques like closed loop systems that replace the need for chemicals, clean production, and so forth. So the use of toxic chemicals by industry in Massachusetts has gone down by over 50% over the last 2 decades, and the toxicity of the chemicals used has gone down enormously. And I'm part of the board of Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow. We've co-authored legislation as majority support in the legislature, which would mandate the phase out of toxic chemicals that are known to be harmful to human health and mandate their replacement with safer substitutes. And TURI is using a tax on the industry to develop those safer substitutes as a whole. That is us privileging the rights of citizens to a clean and healthy environment over the profits of particular companies. And in Europe, the burden is now placed on industry to prove that a chemical is safe before it can be introduced into the marketplace, while in the United States, the burden is placed upon the public to prove that a chemical is dangerous after it's been introduced into the marketplace, which means we're all guinea pigs. And it's very difficult to prove that in a court of law. So a more transformative politics goes to the root causes and seeks to eliminate the production of harm in the first place, and always through the lens of justice and equity. And I really think in many ways the types of technologies that Ryan's talking about, we can't leave that up to private companies. We have to democratize that as much as possible and make sure that the character of these technologies puts equity and justice at the forefront of the design and implementation of these technologies. We don't want to lapse into a type of technological determinism. I know that's not what Ryan's saying at all. But it's too important to be left up to just the market alone. We have to find ways that we can democratize these processes and integrate them into a process for social transformation.
Daniel, we've had a couple of questions start to come in. And when we're talking about, say, policies that are going to try to reduce the presence of toxins in our environment, Juan asked, how do you ensure effective international cooperation towards these climate goals? And anyone, please feel free to jump in.
Well, step one is make sure Biden walks into the White House on January 21st so we can re-enter the Paris Accords, right? I mean,
yeah.
Step one. I mean, that is the first step. I have been impressed with some of the markers that the Asian countries have put down in recent weeks and months towards carbon neutrality goals. It's challenging because we're having this argument about the policy of it, but I also think that in some respects the markets are pushing some of these economies towards climate-friendly policies. One, because they just see on a risk-adjusted basis, a lot of these fossil fuels and kind of extractive industries don't make any sense on a risk-adjusted basis. They don't. And two, because I think there are nations that are at much higher risk than the United States to the impacts of climate. So I think Paris Accord, get back in there January 21st. That's a darn good first step. I think number two is to continue to push, not just for policies and treaties, which in some respects are very hard to enforce, but and this is somewhat counterintuitive to a lot of discussion we've had, but I think a lot of this is about pushing markets, which capital moves across borders more swiftly than anything else right now in the world, and pushing these markets towards recognizing the risk of climate in their financial reporting and in the way they value their companies, and getting capital to slowly but surely kind of reallocate itself around more climate-friendly solutions may be one of the best ways to ensure international cooperation.
Yeah, definitely. Capital has a significant influence over the activities of governments everywhere. And so we're going to be looking at a 720 transition to our next event, just so that you're all aware. So hopefully we can get to a couple more of these questions. I saw one from Ethan that I think is relevant to a lot of the people watching right now, so I'd like to pull that one in. What are some of the most impactful things that students can currently do to begin to address these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll jump in there. I just would agree with Ryan that despite my sort of capitalist, my anti-capitalist approach, I mean, I think we have to begin to make the business case for acting on climate change and acting on climate change quickly. And I think designing markets to respond, whether that's carbon markets or other pricing mechanisms, is probably the most efficacious way to do that quickly. I still worry about the justice issues in that, and I worry about supply chains. I worry about replicating inequality. I mean, there are just a lot of worries there, but I think the markets are where we're going to see the most rapid movement. In terms of students, I mean, my gosh, like to me, the most important thing is to not give up hope, right? And to realize that you were sort of born for this moment. I mean, you were born, it's kind of unfair in a sense because you had nothing to do with it, but this is an opportunity to reshape our world. I mean, I think your generation in particular will suffer a great deal in terms of climate change, but you also have the opportunity to shape a future for future generations. I mean, I'm sort of on the tail end. I mean, I feel like I still have some great years ahead of me, and I'm able to do some really interesting work and exciting work. But the real work is going to happen behind me. I'm absolutely trying to lay a foundation so that people can move into a policy space and bring up an equity issue, and no one's going to look at them like they have three heads. It's like, oh yeah, equity, let's do it. How do we figure this out? But I think in terms of the creative, the inventive, the transformative stuff that Danny was saying, that's going to be on you all, right? To sort of think about what a new economy looks like. Think about what it looks like when borders begin to dissolve, when, race no longer is the issue that it is. I mean, hopefully that will get resolved in this, in your generation. I mean, it's such a phenomenal chance to create a future that is truly equitable. And whenever I sort of think about my students and the work that this sort of discouragement, growing up with climate change, growing up with massive shootings, all of those things, I think about what other generations have gone through, right? And my own sort of lineage and the struggles that my ancestors have gone through. They didn't give up. They kept at it so that I could be here. And so I just encourage that my students keep at it, because you're working for someone else. You're working for a generation that is yet to come. So I'll end there because I know we're going to end up.
Can I say 30 seconds? 30 seconds.
Sure, go ahead.
I think we're on the cusp of a great transformation and a great awakening. It's inevitable. The laws of physics will mandate it. The COVID virus didn't care whatever Trump tweeted. Sea level rise are going to rise no matter what. So we have to respond to the climate crisis. It's not an option. We have to respond. So I think our students now preparing themselves for this great awakening transformation is really important. Giving yourself the skill set, the expertise, and the knowledge so that you can be part of the solution, because it is coming and you are going to have to be part of that solution, whether it's green chemistry or climate engineering or whatever. And also working not only for larger social transformation, democratization, but also in whatever institutions you find yourself in your daily life, working for the changes within those, awakening others to the cause. There's a lot that you can do as an individual to help change the world, and just changing the institutions in which you work, live, and play every day is really part of that struggle.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for ending on a rather positive and hopeful note. We definitely have a lot of work still to do, but I think that it's something that we can all achieve. So thank you, Shalonda, Ryan, Daniel, all for being part of this panel. Thank you for the excellent audience questions as well. I apologize that we weren't able to get to more of them. But now I'm going to hand it over to Kelly Yang, our conference associate, who will be introducing the next session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ariana. Have a good night.
Great to meet you, Ryan.
Take care.
Bye, Ariana.